right, I think we'll go ahead and get started. I'm Casey Vance, Executive Director at Ames History Museum, and I want to welcome you all to our lecture series program tonight. Thanks for coming. And I'm going to go ahead and put a poll up on the screen now, and this will ask how many people are watching with you today from your device, which helps us get a little bit more accurate of a count of attendees. And then there's also a question on there tonight about where you'd like to see future programming, whether in person, virtual, on Zoom, or a mix of both, a hybrid. And then once you complete those polls, we'd also love it if you'd be willing to type into the chat with where you're watching from, especially if you're watching from somewhere other than Ames. We're really interested to see how wide-reaching geographically the lecture series has been this year since we've done it online. And then a couple of other housekeeping things really quick. This program is being recorded, so if you need to leave early or if you lose connection, no worries. And if you have any questions for our speaker during the lecture, I encourage you to use the Q&A box, which is located at the bottom of your screen. And we will be monitoring those questions throughout the lecture, and we'll have time at the end to answer them. And feel free also to use the chat function to ask questions or to chat amongst yourselves as well. And finally, I want to recognize our annual lecture series partner, Ames Public Library. And we're so happy to have this partnership, and I'll go ahead and pass it over to Kathy from the library.
Thank you, Casey. So we are, as always, excited to partner with Ames History Museum for the lecture series, which is offered here in this virtual space rather than in our physical auditorium. And as she said, I'm Kathy Cooney. I'm an adult services librarian. And I wanted to remind you that the library's mission is to connect you to the world of ideas through diverse and inclusive resources and programs. And we're happy to continue connecting our customers to information, including our page for this lecture series, which I will pop in the chat in a minute. And it has a list of related reading that connects to tonight's theme that you can explore, as well as it will have a link to the Ames History Museum's YouTube page with the recording of the lecture. And I also wanted to let you know the library shelves are open for browsing and computers are available if you are in town and want to come check us out. And now I'm going to turn it over to Kathy Speck to introduce tonight's speaker.
Diana Carlin is Professor Emerita of Communication at St. Louis University and a retired faculty member in Communication Studies at the University of Kansas. Some of you may remember Diana's excellent lecture last year on women's suffrage, which was part of the 19th Amendment 100th anniversary celebration. Diana has taught about and researched First Ladies since the 1990s. She is the author or co-author of book chapters on Martha Washington, Lady Bird Johnson, Barbara Bush, Hillary Clinton, and Michelle Obama. She has co-authored the book, Gender and the American Presidency, 9 Presidential Women and the Barriers They Faced. The book looks at multiple women that the authors deemed possible presidential contenders and examines the reasons that they struggled to achieve that status. Very interesting, Diana. That sounds fascinating. So let's hear from you. Take it away.
All right. Thank you so much, Kathy and Casey and Kathy and Alex, for all the support and for the invitation to return and speak with all of you. I had a great time last year with excellent questions. So we'll go at it. I study women in politics, and there are a lot of different ways to study that. And when I began teaching a course at Kansas about 30 years ago, I realized that some of the first women in politics were the president's wives, and that some of them were far more political than anyone would have ever imagined. So that really spurred my interest, and as a result of that, I added a unit on First Ladies to my Women in Politics course. And then also my students said, we want to know more about this. And so I ended up teaching an entire course. And since then, I've been doing a lot of lecturing and a lot of programs like this. So I really appreciate the opportunity to talk with you. I'm getting ready to write a textbook right now. There is not one. There are a lot more courses being taught on First Ladies history and history departments, political science, communication. And so 2 of my friends and I are working on that textbook. So working on this tonight's giving me a chance to pull some things together. So I'm going to share my screen. All right, let me minimize this over here. Okay. All right. So I call this First Ladies More Than the Women Behind the Men. And you will notice down in the lower right-hand corner, an Iowa native here, Lou Henry Hoover, and I'm going to talk about her. So kind of chronologically, Martha Washington, who started it all, Lou Henry Hoover, who I'm going to talk about for me first, there's Nancy Reagan, Laura Bush. All of these women approach the position a little differently, but there are also some things that have always been similar. And when you think about the role of First Lady, oh, I don't know, that's weird that it did that. It didn't do that on my other. This role has really evolved from when we first called the president's wife Lady Washington to today when we call her the First Lady. And that term, First Lady, really didn't catch on until the late 19th century. It was almost 100 and some years ago that we began using that term. Martha Washington was referred to as Lady Washington. And we had titles such as Mrs. President, Lady Presidentress, or just Presidentress. Can you imagine calling First Lady that today? And many of them were just Mrs. President, whatever, or Mrs. Lincoln was how Mary Lincoln wanted to be referred. The first First Lady who ever had that term was when Dolly Madison died, and she was eulogized by Zachary Taylor, and he said she was our First Lady. And that was the first time that term had been used, but then, like I said, it didn't really become popular until the end of the 19th century. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that, about the soft power, what we call the soft power of the hostess role. Something that we call Republican, being a Republican, small r, wife and mother, the private advisor role, and then how these women have become public people in their own right. So what the role is missing, it's not constitutionally set up. There was no requirement for the president's wife to have any kind of a role. So Constitution doesn't say anything about it. There's no legal status. There's no job description. Every First Lady borrows all the way back to Martha Washington on some of the things that she does, but others just sort of define it in their own way. It's said that, because they don't have an official title, that title, as I said, has changed over time, that people haven't really known how to define the First Lady in terms of their husband, because if you're a Lady Presidentress, that sort of says that you are a part of the presidency. If you're Mrs. Lincoln, you're the wife of someone. So the title has often helped define, and the way the women have used that title has often helped define the way that they were perceived both by themselves and by the public. There's also no pay. They don't get paid anything. They get to live in the White House, they get all the perks of the presidency, obviously, but there is no salary. And really until recently, until Rosalynn Carter, they didn't really even have their own budget. So whatever the East Wing the West Wing was really willing to give to the East Wing was sort of how they function. And they often borrowed people from other agencies. They didn't even really have a paid staff until Edith Roosevelt, Teddy's wife. So that was in the 20th century. So we went from Martha all the way to Edith Roosevelt without anyone really being paid to be an assistant of any type to the First Lady. So what the role was missing, but what it became was a partnership that was just rooted in tradition. And a lot of this developed as a result of the way we set up the presidency. We decided when we didn't want a monarch that we were going to come up with this Republican form of government. And in fact, they weren't even sure what to call Washington for a while. But the president has the dual responsibilities of being the head of the government, which is typically what a prime minister has in a parliamentary system, and the head of state, which was what a monarch had. Or in countries that have a president and a prime minister, the president does the ceremonial kinds of functions, and the prime minister deals with more the governmental types of things. So in the UK, for example, the head of state is the Queen, and the head of government is the prime minister. So you don't really hear much about prime ministers' wives because they usually have their own jobs. They aren't that much a part of this because the royal family is doing the ribbon cutting and all of this type of thing. But when Martha Washington joined George in New York, which was where our first capital was, she was greeted with a multi-gun salute. He took her across, she came to New Jersey, he took her across over into New York in the presidential yacht, 47-foot yacht, to great acclaim, cheering in the streets. And all her way to New York, she had various stops and people would cheer her, and she'd actually make a couple comments thanking them. And so to our knowledge, she's the first woman in the US who ever stood up and gave some type of a speech in public. Just didn't happen until late, probably about the 30s and 40s, 1830s and 1840s, that women began giving speeches. So in many ways, Washington just said, this is a partnership. And when she got there, she found out they already had a schedule of events for her, and that there were certain things that the men had decided that she was and wasn't going to do. And there were times she said she felt like a prisoner. There's a wonderful book called Worthy Partner. It's The Papers of Martha Washington by Joseph Fields. And these are all of the pieces of correspondence that they could find. There were only 3 between her and Washington because they burned everything. And that made it really difficult when I was writing a book chapter about her. So you kind of figure out things about her from what other people wrote to her and also what she wrote to them. So most of these women were a mirror of their times. They sort of did the role within the constraints of what was expected of women, but they also were disruptors or trendsetters. They often bucked what that role was. And we're going to talk about quite a few women who did that. And then over time, they've become public figures in their own right. And you notice all the books that were up there, many of them are biographies. So they're women who people think have done enough noteworthy, either in the way they affected their president, the presidency of their husband, or what they've done in their own right, that they deserve some type of a biography. And then they've all been writing their autobiographies or their memoirs. So we've really seen this partnership starting with the Washingtons, and then these women becoming public figures in their own right. So let's talk a little bit about what I call the soft power of a hostess. These are the levees. Here's Martha over here, and this is probably Abigail Adams sitting next to her. And George is off on the side, and he would not wear his cocked hat, and he would not have his sword, and he would just stand off to the side, and people would come in and greet Martha. These were weekly levees that they called them. And so this was a way for anyone who was dressed appropriately to come to the White House to meet the First Lady, who was called Lady Washington, and the president in a very informal setting, but a lot of business took place in this way. Dolly Madison became expert at that. This is a reception line with the Lincolns. Ulysses Grant is over here. You see President Lincoln, but Mary would have been off to the side. They cut her off. These are the Roosevelts. A lot of this kind of gracious hosting had ended for a while. And when Teddy Roosevelt came in, they really began doing that again. And the little comment below here talks about how this sort of culture and class was returned to the White House with the Roosevelts. So like I said, it started with Martha and her thank you speeches. She not only was expected to do these levees, but she also attended all the dinners that the president had. And so her dinner time conversation with heads of state, with emissaries from foreign governments especially, then ended up being reflected in letters that she wrote to other people. But you could tell that what she did with her dinner time conversations became very important in promoting what her husband wanted. They also had Friday evening levees, which both of them hosted, and she had an afternoon hour where she would come in for an hour and then she would get up and leave, and she would let anyone come in who was appropriate. She wasn't originally allowed to return social visits. People would leave calling cards, and then you were supposed to go back and call on them. And they didn't want her to do that. But she later just said, look, I've got all these people coming here, and this is important for us to establish us as part of this society, as part of what's happening in the capital city. And I need to go call on the people who call on me. And so she would usually take Abigail Adams with her. She also became a surrogate for the president. And so she attended a funeral. This is another instance of where he was bedridden because he had an infection, and she went in his place. So very early in his presidency, she did what the wives still do, and that is fill in for their husbands. But in doing so, you know, she could say who was at the funeral, whatever conversation she heard. So this becomes a soft power. Dolly Madison was a master at this, and she was really the essence of it. She was a veteran and enthusiastic hostess. Thomas Jefferson's wife, Martha, had died many years before he became president. His daughters tried to fill in the role, but they had young children and they were cleared down, you know, it's about a 3.5 hour car drive now. So you can imagine how long it took to get to Monticello back in those days. So he asked Dolly Madison, who was the wife of then Secretary of State James Madison, to fill in as the hostess for him in many instances. Plus, as Secretary of State, Madison was hosting his own. So she became a very, very seasoned hostess. And she was very good at arranging seating so that she had certain people who could then report back to her on what their conversations were with, say, members of Congress who were in opposition to her husband. And she would make sure that a single woman might be sitting next to them, and then they would report back to her. She believed that not only were the people of the country her husband's constituents, but they were hers. She really believed in this partnership that the Washingtons had, that the Adams had, and that she and James Madison had. And so she really felt like she needed to open the White House. She did exactly the same kinds of things as the Washingtons. And you have to remember, she's the first one who lived in the White House, except for during the period after the War of 1812, when it was being rebuilt after 1814. But the Adams were only there for a short period of time, and the Washingtons were only, they were in New York and in Philadelphia. So she was the first one who would have had 8 years if it hadn't been for the burning. So to really establish those kinds of things in the White House, Dolly was really the one who was able to do that. And so she really mastered the art of conversation for political gain. So she would, you know, be moving from one part of the room to another when she had a levee, and she would be, you know, subtly asking things and then pass it along to her husband. So she used those social events often to pull people together into corners to talk to one another, and she would raise issues. So she really was the master of the soft power and used that hostess role for something other than just social. Mary Lincoln was a very embattled first lady, and there are some new, here's the full picture that didn't cut Mary off. There's a new biography that is in process, and I've heard the author of it speak at 2 different colloquium and symposium I've been on. And I really can hardly wait for that to come out, because it really gives us a little different view of Mary Lincoln. But she was accused of too much hostess work and too many parties and too many things that she did even for the troops to try to boost morale. But she really thought that the entertaining was necessary because there was a lot of dissension as to what needed to be done during the war. And so she needed to get some of her husband's rivals together. And so the same types of things that her predecessors had done, she saw that necessity, but she also thought it was important to demonstrate to France and England, who were remaining neutral at that time, that the Union was stable, that business was going on in Washington like normal, that these types of things were still happening, and that if people felt like they were being invited into the White House, it would actually be a morale booster. And then, like I said, she did a lot of things with the troops. She also volunteered in hospitals, and she picked up information that she was hearing from the men, and she would relate that back to her husband. So the kinds of things she did to just go greet the soldiers who were recovering from injuries, this was also a type of soft power. So like I said, criticized for her excesses, but she had a real logic to what she did. Edith Roosevelt, as I said, was basically credited with sort of a return to style with a lot of these kinds of receptions, what Martha would have called a levee. She also is responsible for creating the West Wing. Up until this time, the president's office was on the same floor as the living quarters, where the bedrooms were. And Teddy Roosevelt had rambunctious children, and they were running up and down the hallways. The Lincoln children were the same way. And so it was really not a good way to mix family and business. So Edith added the West Wing. And as a part of that, she decided to use a hallway to add stature to the role of first ladies. And so she put all of the First Lady's portraits so that when visitors came into the White House, they had to walk past all of these portraits of these women and were reminded that these women had been a part of the White House and had been a part of American history also. So she really began to give prominence to First Ladies and to their role in the White House. She brought world-class musicians into the White House and once again brought in both members of the President's Party, members of the Democratic Party, people from business and industry, and wonderful musicians, so that people had this social opportunity, but it also helped her husband then do these informal kinds of conversations. The other second kind of attribute of these women is something that we call Republican wifehood and motherhood. And Jean Abrams wrote an entire book looking at our early founding mothers as Republican wives and mothers. And the way she defined this is what we would today call our responsibility to ensure that the next generation would be provided with the tools to become loyal and productive citizens. And a good Republican wife was one who carried out valued domestic responsibilities while fulfilling their duty as a patriotic American. So a lot of these early First Ladies, like I said, mirrored the times. Martha was often pictured with family, and they kept family time. These are the Roosevelts. There are the Eisenhowers, and I'm a Kansan, so I'm big on the Eisenhowers. The Kennedys with their family, Michelle Obama, and then the Trumps. So Martha Washington was a wife and mother. These were their grandchildren. The grandchildren's father, her son from her first marriage, who Washington really raised as his own child. He was 2, I think, when they married. He died after Yorktown. He caught a disease at Yorktown, and his widow was left with 4 children. So they basically adopted these 2 as their children, but they were the grandchildren. And so she really saw that one of her responsibilities when she got to New York and Philadelphia was to get them educated, both her granddaughter and her grandson, and that she saw this as being a model for what other women should be doing to make sure that their children and grandchildren were being educated so they could become productive citizens. And that she also was there to support George, like being the surrogate. And so you saw many of the First Ladies who took that very traditional role, all the way up to Melania Trump, who I'll talk about in a minute, who followed some of that Republican motherhood type of thing. One of my former students, Tammy Vigil, wrote a book looking at this role of Republican motherhood and looking at it with Michelle Obama and Melania Trump. So she really represented this Republican woman who was here to help the country. And the president's health and welfare, that was part of what she wanted. Family time, getting away from Washington, going back to Mount Vernon. Edith Roosevelt found that living above the office just simply did not work. So she then was the one who said, we have to expand the White House. So she was then able to keep the second floor as family space. And she really embraced motherhood. In fact, she had 2 miscarriages during the time they were in the White House. And remember, he came into the White House as a vice president on the death of the president. So she really embraced her motherhood, and she believed that she was to really protect her children and her stepdaughter, Alice Roosevelt Longworth. Alice's husband was a member of Congress, and the Longworth building is named after him. So part of what she believed she had to do, even though they were living in a fishbowl, was ensure her children's education. So she made sure that they were in school, that they were getting tutoring if they needed it. She actually had Sunday school in the White House for her children because she believed that they needed the moral upbringing. So this was another way that she sort of exuded this notion of being a Republican wife and mother, that she needed to raise her children well because they were the future generations. She also believed that she had to maintain family privacy and that was a very, very important part of her role. She absolutely disdained the press. And Stacy Cordery, who's a professor at Iowa State University in history, has written about Edith Roosevelt in another book that I have on the list at the end by Lewis Gould called America's First Ladies, Their Lives and Their Legacy. And Stacy talks about how the media wanted to know about what she was wearing and what Alice was wearing. And so they would describe the same dress. They would wear clothes several different times, but they'd give the media a different description of the dress so they thought it was something different. And they totally confused them as to what they were wearing. And she would feed the media pictures. So this was a posed picture. There were never any unposed pictures with the Roosevelts. And this was how she fed the media frenzy to find out about the president and his family. So she really found a way, even if in a fishbowl, to provide some privacy with carefully giving information to the press and also carefully feeding them photographs that she had staged, the kids with animals, their pets, and that type of thing. So this was a very important thing for her to see, that the first family needed a family living quarters that had nothing to do with what the president was doing during the day. The Eisenhowers and the Kennedys. Interesting back to back. I decided to put these together because they really showed some generational change that was going on in the 50s and 60s. Mamie was a military wife, and she brought that military background. You know, she was the one who had to pack up and move all the time. She had to make a lot of sacrifices. And so, you know, being in the White House was the first and longest that they had ever been together for that long a period of time. And she wanted it to be a family space. And she was, you know, she had the grandchildren. So here are the 4 grandchildren. This one here, Mary Jean, is someone who I've gotten to know over the last several years, and she now is living in Abilene, carrying on that tradition of making sure that the family history is remembered. But the Eisenhowers became the model of what grandparents were in the 50s. And they were certainly a lot like my grandparents, being a young child in the 50s. And so this was part of what she did. She was, you know, she set styles for women, but she also was there for her husband, especially during his illnesses. And so this very much was influenced by that military background, where she understood also the social side of this. And she was an incredible hostess and did a lot of social activities for the wives of members of Congress, because she knew those wives were important, and she saw the political wives as being very similar to military wives. And as a result of that, she would bring the Republican and Democrat wives together. And, you know, we had a lot of bipartisanship back then. And a lot of that was, it was a different time. And Mamie did a lot to encourage that kind of cross-fertilization of ideas with the wives working on projects together. Then you had the Kennedys following them, young family with young children. But Jackie Kennedy made it very clear that her first responsibility was to her children. And there's a quotation from her that basically says that if you don't do a good job of raising your children, then basically, you know, what is your legacy? And so she, you know, she set up the kindergarten, similar to what other first ladies had done. She had the kindergarten for Carolyn in the White House. She did very little public speaking. In fact, you know, when I was doing research on Lady Bird Johnson, I found out how much she had actually done in the way of public speaking when she was second lady, and that the standard thing was that there would be something that would come in for Jackie Kennedy in the way of a speaking engagement, and her staff would say, give it to Lady Bird. And so they would just give everything to Lady Bird, and Lady Bird did what a first lady would have done in terms of the public face of the administration, because Jackie really believed that it was her responsibility to be with her very young children. And if you remember, she had another pregnancy during the White House, and that baby died within, I believe, 24 hours of his birth. Patrick, I believe, was his name. And so, you know, she really was tending to her family, and she also knew about her husband's health issues. So she really felt that that was the important thing for her to be doing. But she also, in the same sense of Republican motherhood and wifehood and being a good citizen, saw the White House as the people's house. And she saw that it had really not been preserved and restored in a way that reflected our history. The early presidents had to bring their own furniture in. They got very little money from Congress to either entertain or to furnish the White House. They got very small allocations. So oftentimes they'd give the furniture away, they'd sell it when they'd leave, and it was scattered all over. And she wanted to bring that back and wanted to restore what had been part of the White House history. And that was because she really saw this as the people's house, that their job as a family was to maintain that for the larger American citizenry. Michelle Obama called herself mom in chief. And so that was her first responsibility. Her children were young when they came into the White House, and she wanted them to have as normal a life as possible. And so she was a self-declared mom in chief. She had originally planned to stay in Chicago until the school year was over, like what Melania Trump did. But his administration convinced her that, no first lady, that wasn't true because others had come late just because of transportation issues, but that no modern first lady had not come with the president. And so that she really needed to do it and that they needed her. And if you looked at her issues, many people actually accused her of being a throwback in some ways. They were expecting, this Harvard educated lawyer to be a little more like Hillary, but not too far like Hillary, and to really, do some things and take on issues that were bigger than what they saw her as doing. But her issues were largely children and family related, which ties back into that Republicanism notion. So military families was one of her big issues, which she did with Jill Biden, and now Jill Biden is following in on that. Healthy food. She worked behind the scenes. She didn't testify in front of Congress on some of the laws that were done to change the way that school lunches were provided. And then education. She gave a lot of speeches to students of all ages about the importance of education and how education was their ticket to whatever it is they wanted to do. And she used her life and Barack Obama's life as an example of what education could do. So there was that good Republican, motherhood, ensuring that you have the next generation prepared. And then Melania Trump, she delayed her move to the White House so that Barron could get through his school year. They maintained his privacy very, very closely. She really believed that that was one of her responsibilities, was really to take care of the family. She was often very invisible. And what she did do, though, was she used social media. And unless you were on social media, you didn't see that she had a lot of YouTubes that were, talking. She even had a YouTube on why you should wear a mask, which was a little at odds with her husband. Her issues, though, were children's issues. Be best. During the pandemic, she wanted to do things for children to keep them busy. So on her Twitter account, she would have links to crossword puzzles or other word games that children could do, so parents would have some things for them to do at home. So once again, she really kind of epitomized this sort of throwback idea to this being a wife and mother as sort of her first responsibility to the president. Then you have the women who decided that this was a powerful man to whom they were married, and that this meant that they also had a certain level of power and influence. And so I'll kind of go through these and we're going to talk about some more specifically. Abigail Adams, Sarah Polk with her husband, James Polk. And I got a picture of the two of them together because they were a real partnership. Edith Wilson and Woodrow, the Roosevelts. And I'm not going to talk about Eleanor Roosevelt other than to say that she was obviously Roosevelt's eyes, his legs. She was a trusted advisor. Their marital situation may have just been a convenience type of thing, but they were truly wedded in terms of a political life. And she was as much an advisor to him as anyone. And she had her own radio show. She wrote her own newspaper column. And Eleanor was really the first lady to come out and begin doing all of these things, to have news conferences, and to really take that role and build it into what we see the modern first lady doing. Lady Bird and Lyndon, and we'll talk a little bit about, and the Clintons. I'm not going to spend much time talking about them because they're recent enough history, you know it. I really want to tell you about some of these women who you don't know a whole lot about, because we haven't really studied them in history the way that we've studied their husbands. But these are the women who I would say really were definite private advisors. All of the women advised in some ways, but this group of women had a far larger, more active role than some of the other women. So let's start with Abigail, and I call her the consummate partner. She was an inveterate letter writer. The Massachusetts Historical Society has all of the Adams papers, and they do a wonderful set of publications. And if you go to their website, they did a whole year on Abigail last year, and there are just a lot of the documents that they've opened up of hers. But Abigail and John were apart a large part of the time. And so letters were the way that they stay connected. And Abigail always expressed her political views to John. In fact, one of the most famous quotations she had, which I used a year ago when I talked about women's rights and suffrage, was when in 1776, she wrote to John and said, okay, you're going to start this new country, and let's not start where we left off with England. Let's start afresh and remember the ladies, is what she said. Because if you don't, we will foment a revolution, because we need a voice just like the men do, and we have something to say. And Abigail had a lot to say. She was incredibly outspoken in her opinions. She wrote what she thought in her letters. And one of her letters was actually, because of the way the mail system worked, Adams' enemies would often intercept the letters. Post office wasn't quite as private back then. And one of her letters was actually read by at a Massachusetts town hall meeting, which is where they were from originally, condemning her for some of the things that she said politically. I mean, can you imagine, somebody intercepting a letter between a president and his wife today, and then somebody get up and reading it before it ever got to the president? But that's what happened with the Adams. It wasn't an uncommon thing, because she was a letter writer, but she certainly was speaking out politically and giving John her advice. She also would write to family and friends, and she would essentially write letters that were op-eds or letters to the editor, and then she would urge them to send them on to a newspaper under their names. And so she was finding ways of getting her husband's message out, or even sending a message to him about something. So she really did attempt to influence public opinion. She would go up and watch sessions of Congress and then come back and tell her husband what's going on, stand around the hallways. But she was a very, very trusted advisor. And they often said that when she was out of town, having to go back to tend to the family business and farms, that he some of the time made some bad decisions. And some of his friends said if Abigail had been here, he might not have made some of these mistakes. So she was really the consummate partner. Sarah Polk is somebody who most of us had not heard much about. I knew nothing about Sarah Polk until I got into the history of First Ladies. She was very well educated. Her father was well educated. Like many of the suffrage women, had a father who made sure that his daughters were educated as well as his sons. And she became a very key player in James Polk's ascendancy to the presidency. He had had other political offices. They were from Tennessee. He had become Speaker of the House. So they'd had a Washington life. They had no children, and his career was her child. And so this was basically, what her life was his political career. And when he was being considered for president, she was writing letters to the editors of papers, encouraging them to endorse. Sounds a little like Abigail. And she was writing his speeches. Now, presidents didn't go out and give speeches during campaigns, but he gave speeches to various groups within the party. And so she really was very much providing a lot of his words. She continued to assist with his speeches when he became president. Her office was right next door to his. Even though she didn't have a First Lady staff, she was really his secretary, his administrative assistant. And she would summarize multiple newspapers every morning and give him the summary of what was being said. She served as a gatekeeper for who got to see him and who didn't. And she really became a channel of information for him because as a gatekeeper, she would talk to people before she'd decide who was going to see him and who didn't. She was out and about in Washington all of the time, and she used that soft power to provide information to him and to make it clear what she thought his position ought to be. He's the president of Manifest Destiny, and she was a firm believer in that and highly encouraged him in that area. So Sarah Polk, truly a woman ahead of her time and fascinating. She became a friend of Dolly Madison's. Dolly Madison died right before he left office, and Dolly became a mentor to her. Edith Wilson, I put a question mark, first woman president? She was a gatekeeper, the second wife of Woodrow Wilson. His first wife died, and we'll talk about her in a minute. She, even before he became ill, she was still a gatekeeper as to who got to see him. She worked with his appointment secretary. She worked with his chief of staff. She screened the mail. During the war, she was the one that Wilson trusted to decode messages that were coming into him. She had the codes and no one else in his administration, and they would sit together and she would do the decoding. She went with him to Paris for the Treaty of Versailles, and she then gave advice to him on what his post-war strategies ought to be for getting the League of Nations established. And she tried to get him to put some people on the commission that was looking into that. He didn't take her advice, and maybe he should have. When he did have his stroke during this tour that he was taking to promote the League of Nations, she concealed the illness from the public and even from his cabinet members. There is a National Geographic, if you go on their website, did a wonderful documentary about 6 months ago on Edith Wilson and the way that she and his doctor basically kept the public in the dark as to how serious his illness was. She screened all of the paperwork that was coming in. She would take things into him. She would occasionally take a person into him on days that were good and he could sit up in bed and maybe sign something. What we really don't know is how much she signed herself, how many decisions she made without consulting him. But there's a good chance that she did do some of that. And, you know, there's a lot of kind of forensic analysis going on right now of memos and various things as they continue to find materials in Library of Congress and in the Wilson papers, various places, that she may have been making some decisions that were definitely above her non-pay grade. Lady Bird Johnson was a public first lady who had an incredible amount of private influence. She financed his political career. Her mother died when she was young. Her mother was wealthy. Her father was pretty well-to-do. And she went to her father and asked for an advance on her inheritance to finance his first run for Congress. He had worked for a congressman, and that's what he was doing when she met him when she was a student at UT Austin, and they had a whirlwind romance and married after only, I think, about 8 or 12 weeks of knowing one another, but he knew she was the woman for him. She also built a media empire, and so made millions. A lot of questions about how some of those licenses were granted, but she was a very savvy businesswoman. But she not only financed his political career, but he had surgery during his first campaign, and she was the one who got on the phone and got out the vote and did everything that needed to be done. When he had meetings, she learned how to take shorthand in high school, and she took notes from those meetings. So she was the one with the notes, with the information. And then when he was president, she would sit up in the family quarters, watch the television when he gave a speech or when he had a news conference, and she'd take notes in shorthand, and then she would call him and give him a critique. And I highly recommend that you Google Lady Bird Johnson critiquing Lyndon Johnson's speech and listen to it. It is hysterical because she grades him. And when I was writing my chapter on her, I actually was able to get a copy of her shorthand notes, and I know shorthand. And so I could see that what she was saying to him in this recording was taken almost verbatim from the notes she was writing. And then, of course, she played a very large role in convincing him he needed to run for his own term in '64, and then convincing him that it was time to go back to the ranch in '68. And there's a new book out, Karen Tumulty, which you saw that up on the screen. Or I'm sorry, Julia Swag, who I think is overstating that she was hidden in plain sight, because I don't think she was. People have known about this, but there are some new parts of those recordings. And then these first ladies eventually became a public person in their own right. Nellie Taft, Ellen Wilson, Florence Harding, Lou Henry Hoover, Eleanor, who I once again will not talk about, Lady Bird, Pat Nixon. We have also here Betty Ford. So let me talk about a few of these in some detail. Helen Nellie Taft really put her own stamp on the role. She decided the first ladies never accompanied their husband to and from the inauguration. They went separately. She rode back to the White House, to the reviewing stand with her husband, and she was very proud of the fact that she was the first woman who did that. And she just basically was making a statement, a little like Martha on the barge, we're in this together. She had a very good working relationship with the press, especially with women journalists. And she really wanted to promote women journalists because she was a real supporter of women's rights and also of racial equality. And she made it very clear that she was a suffragist. And very, very few first ladies actually took a real overt stand on that, but Nellie Taft was willing to do that. Her most visible and lasting legacy are the cherry blossom trees in Potomac Park. She really learned how to do a lot of this role when he was the Director General in the Philippines. And they saw that there was this public space where people of all classes came together for music. And so she began these concerts because she loved music. And so this was part of what she was doing, was bringing the different classes and the different races together for a common activity in Washington, D.C. And she was also very visible at important meetings, and she was quoted in the press. So she really began to move that first lady into a more public position. And also, as I said, took some very, very strong stances in terms of civil rights and women's rights. Ellen Wilson, Woodrow Wilson's first wife, was an artist, a very accomplished artist in her own right. And she had an exhibit right before, it was after he was elected, but right before he went into the White House, which received great critical review. She had tremendous magazine coverage with her art, with stories about her. And she even entered a competition after she was First Lady under a pseudonym. But probably one of the things that she's best known for was that she was the first First Lady to actively lobby for a piece of legislation. And when she discovered that there were these alleyways in DC that were just basic cesspools, and families were living them in horrible conditions. And so she brought people down to see them. She put money into an association that was going to build new housing for them, and she contributed to that until the day she died. And they passed the legislation the day she died. And it was the Alley Bill, and so the First Lady to do that. Florence Harding, master of public relations, and Stacy Cordery has a wonderful program she did, and I'm going to give you a link later to where you can see that on Florence Harding's public relations. But she also promoted women's issues, and she believed that, women had the vote at this time, that they needed to have civic literacy. They needed to understand how government worked. So she worked with a lot of women's groups. She sort of developed the photo op, and here's a good example of this, where groups would come to the White House and she would make sure she was photographed with them. And then she'd give little impromptu speeches to them. So it wasn't a formal speech, but she was getting things into the press that way, and she loved being quoted. She was also very forthcoming with her medical records, and she really handled some of the scandals in her husband's administration. The way she dealt with them with the press was very well done. Iowa's own Lou Henry Hoover, another one of my favorites. This woman, talk about somebody who was a woman in her own right, highly educated. The first woman to graduate from Stanford with a degree in geology. She spoke 5 languages, and she learned Chinese when they were working in China. She was involved in the Boxer Rebellion and was doing medical work. She helped found the Girl Scouts in the U.S. There's a National Athletic Association, and she formed the women's division of that and was very much in favor of women's sports so that they would have their own division and wouldn't be discriminated against. Just an incredibly accomplished woman, and I could do a whole program just on her. But one of the things she did was she was the first Lady to give a radio address, and she began doing formal public speeches. So she really broke that barrier of being that Florence Harding was starting to do, but she took it to a formal level. She also supported civil rights and invited the wife of an Republican African-American congressman from Illinois to the White House. It caused a huge uproar, but she did it anyway, and Mrs. DePriest came to one of her teas, and they made this statement because they believed that African-Americans were going to be important to the Republican Party. And then she also created a political program to help fight the Great Depression. Lady Bird Johnson, I've already said quite a bit about her, but she was the first one to have her own campaign, her whistle stop through the South in 1964. First one to hire a press secretary who came from the press. Jackie Kennedy hired the first press secretary. And then her environmental emphasis, which was more than taking down billboards of beautification. It was truly environmentalism. And then she helped promote LBJ's Great Society programs. I really think Pat Nixon is one of the most underrated first ladies. She was the first lady to endorse the ERA, and she took a pro-choice stand after one of the first to ever do that. She launched a volunteerism campaign and canvassed the country on behalf of volunteerism. She publicly lobbied her husband to appoint a woman Supreme Court justice. And she also, before the ADA, made the White House accessible putting in the first ramp, putting visitors materials in multiple languages, having visually impaired come in and having docents who would explain and let them touch artifacts and get a special tour because she wanted this to be everybody's house. And until Hillary Clinton, she was the first lady with the most international travel. In fact, she made speeches to 3 African congresses. And then when there was an earthquake in Peru, she flew down and with the first lady of Peru, started a big humanitarian effort. There's a book that's going to be coming out on her in a couple of years by a woman named Heath Ledger Lee, and it's going to really put Pat Nixon where she belongs. Betty Ford, after Pat Nixon, a very authentic voice. She's also supported the ERA and Roe v. Wade. She had breast cancer, and this was a time when people didn't talk about it, and she let everybody know about her surgery. She went public with the details and released her medical records. She encouraged women to get mammograms and began giving a lot of speeches about the importance of women's health and mammograms, and probably saved a lot of women's lives. She'd also been in therapy after her first marriage ended in divorce, and she talked about that and the importance of psychiatric help. And then this is the 60 Minutes interview where she was asked if she thought her children had smoked pot or if her daughter maybe had had premarital relations, and she said yes to both, and really began to humanize the first family, that she was a woman who said what was on her mind. And when she left the White House and it became known that she had an addiction problem that came from a pinched nerve, we now have the Betty Ford Hazelden Center and what she has done for addiction issues. These women also, and I'm mindful of my time, are also, we know a lot about them because they are more recent. Rosalind Carter, who testified before Congress, she was the second presidential wife. Eleanor was the first on mental health and helped get a major mental health bill passed. Nancy Reagan, her Just Say No, trying to stop the drug addiction that was going on in the country. Used public television, made appearances on programs such as Different Strokes, but she really took that campaign seriously. Barbara Bush is here at a place called Grandmother's House, holding a pediatrics AIDS baby who got it from an IV infected mother. And she showed everybody that you couldn't get AIDS from casual contact. Everything she's done for literacy, especially with her foundation, has been phenomenal. Hillary Clinton here testifying on healthcare. She took it a step too far, went beyond what a first lady should do to trying to craft the legislation herself, and we know that all backfired. Barbara Bush, who gave the first radio address, Saturday radio address by a first lady in place of the president after 9/11, talking about the women in Afghanistan, and this has become one of her major causes, are women and girls in Afghanistan and other countries where they have not had the opportunities. And we all know a lot about what Michelle Obama's done, and Jill Biden is still a page that's meant to be written. So a few resources and then your questions. I go to the White House Historical Association, and just put in the search First Ladies Symposium, which was held last few weeks ago. And it's a whole day event, and you can pick the topics, but there's a link. And then there's a book here, which I'm going to donate to the library. Catherine Sibley's Companion to First Ladies. It's a great read. I have co-authored chapter on Michelle Obama and authored a chapter on Barbara Bush. Stacey Cordry from Iowa State has some chapters in here. And you will have a copy of this in the Ames Public Library. And then the National First Ladies Library, I have a link to them. They have a lot of interesting information. They aren't actually a library in that they don't really have very many papers. They've purchased some, but it's not really a place where anybody's put their papers. But they do a lot of online education, and there's some great material. And then coming soon, an association that I'm one of the 7 founders of called FLAIR, the First Ladies Association for Research and Education. Our website will go live in mid-June. And we're a membership organization to promote education and research about First Ladies, but we're going to have a lot of information for the public. We're going to have webinars, we're going to have podcasts, material for kids, and so we're very excited that we're going to launch that in June. So with that said, I will now go to your questions. Oh, I went far over time, I'm sorry.
You're okay on time.
Okay.
One question that has come in so far, how do you think the duties of the position will change someday when there is the first woman president, and therefore it's a first man instead of a first lady?
Well, I think we have a pretty good model with the second gentleman, and we have a lot of women governors. In fact, you have women governors now. We've had 3 in Kansas. And I think, the way it's going to change is that they're going to be more like Jill Biden. They're going to keep their day job. I think Jill Biden is sort of the forerunner of what we're going to have with the first gentleman. And Douglas Emhoff is showing us what the second gentleman's doing. He's doing some very traditional things. He's been reading to kids. He's been giving speeches. So he's doing some of the traditional things, but he has a day job at Georgetown as a law professor. Conflicts of interest become difficult. And, as he found, he had to give up his law firm position. But I think you're going to find, as we found with women governors, that the husbands will continue to do what they're doing, but they'll make some appearances, they'll host some events. And I think you will see kind of what the modern first lady has become, being replicated, but on a lesser level. The hostess role isn't going to be that big for them, I don't think. But a good question.
That's the only question that I'm seeing so far. I encourage everyone to go ahead and type in additional questions if you have them.
I have a question here for Diana. Given your research on women's suffrage, what do you find interesting about the time period, obviously moving to 1920 and women's suffrage passing, but also Edith Wilson kind of somewhat being in possibly the most power that any woman had at that point? Are there anything interesting you find in that time period happening?
Yeah, I mean, she could have done so much and she didn't. She was very quiet on the subject. You had some of the women around that same time period, like a Nellie Taft, Florence Harding, who were, very much about women's rights. And we had other, Abigail Adams was about as outspoken as you get on the subject. And Sarah Polk. I mean, we had a lot of other women before 1920. But Edith Wilson remained very quiet on the issue, and she didn't do much to lobby him, even if she was in favor of it, but she certainly made no statement. She took no position, and she could have done something, which kind of makes you wonder how committed she was to it. I think once he got on board, she was on board, but it was not anything that she was very involved in. Now, what happened was you then get Lou Henry Hoover, who began, after you've had women voting for about, I guess he was elected in 28. They've been voting for 8 years nationally. We know in some states like Kansas, they've been voting for 8 years before that, and in other elections for 100 years. And so they, she was very much in favor of women's rights and women being involved politically. Eleanor Roosevelt certainly was, because she became active in the women's division of the Democratic Party. So you did, once suffrage happened, you began seeing the first ladies taking a much more active role and promoting women's rights.
Another question someone asked is, what is the chance for passage of the ERA, do you think?
Oh, I'm not too optimistic about it. The time ran out, so I'm not a constitutional expert. I wish my husband were here because I could ask him, but we've kind of had some discussions about this. I think they would have to reintroduce it. So you'd then have to go through the congressional. I don't know if they'd have to get the congressional passage again, or if they just have to take it. It's kind of complicated when an amendment doesn't get the 2/3 of the states. So I'm not very optimistic. I think we're just going to keep chipping away at it, one piece of legislation at a time, which is what's happened since it wasn't ratified. Oh, do I think there should be a job description for first ladies? No, I don't. I really don't. I think one of the beauties of the position is that every woman has really defined it as her own. Even though they've done the hostess role, they've done the family piece, they've been supportive of their husbands, the modern first ladies have had their causes. Even, women like Mary Lincoln had her causes. She gave money to the newly freed slaves to support them. And as I said, some of these other women supported causes. But I just think that it's a role that the woman needs to define, and it has to be defined in conjunction with her husband. And when we have the first gentleman, they're going to have to define that. So I really think it's better to not have a job description. We have time for any more, maybe?
Yeah. Do you think Kamala Harris will be the next Democratic presidential candidate?
Oh, I'll tell you, we have how many political lifetimes between now and 2024? It's possible. What I've seen lately is that her positive ratings are pretty low. They're like around 40%, and her negatives are about 48%. And even within the Democratic Party, her positives aren't very high. So I'd say, right now, I think she'd be challenged. And we haven't really seen what she's going to do with the vice presidential role. So I think until we get a better sense of how she's going to be a vice president, it's going to be kind of hard to really predict that. But, right now, I don't know that she's in an especially strong position to not be challenged.
And somebody asked, will you clarify your use of big R Republican and small r Republican in general, and as you used on your slides?
Okay. Yeah. With the big R, it's the party. With the small r, it's anything related to a republic or a Republican form of government. So, we're a federal republic. And so, especially in the early days, they really considered themselves Republicans, small r Republicans, because they supported a republic, which was a form of government that was different from a monarchy. So you had, regardless of what political party, whether they were Federalists or whatever, they really, Whigs, Federalists, whatever some of these early ones were, they all considered themselves Republicans. And it wasn't until 1854 that the Republican Party with a large R came in. So when I'm using that term, I'm using it the way that the founders used it, and that was the form of government that they set up, was a Republican form of government, where citizens had a role. And this is where the Republican wife and mother came in, because they didn't have a vote, they couldn't hold office. So their role in the republic was basically to make sure the next generation was well taken care of, that they were doing what needed to be done with hearth and home and their husbands, so that they could contribute to building this republic. Because it was very fragile. And so you really needed everybody kind of in this together doing what they could do. And this was the way they defined the women's roles.
All right, I think that is all of the questions. So thank you so much, Diana, for the wonderful program tonight. And thanks again, everybody, for attending. Our next lecture series program is on June 30th with Gloria Betcher presenting Foundations for One Community, the History of People of Color in Ames, Earliest Times to 1950. And you can visit our website, ameshistory.org, for more information about that. And we hope to see you at the museum, at the library, or online again soon. Have a great rest of your evening, everybody, and take care.
And thank you again for the invitation and for joining me tonight. I appreciate it.